On this channel, you'll see it all, including the most bizarre things the world has ever witnessed. We are a journal of anomalies, and everything you see here is based on true events. Enjoy, and be careful with what's beside you.
I always preferred the night shift. There's something soothing about the way the roads unfurl beneath the dim glow of streetlights, the world hushed and waiting. You'd think it would be lonely, driving through those southern backroads, but I've always found company in the whispers of the night. Tips are better, too. Night owls are generous folk, eager to get home to wherever they're headed. Tonight felt different, though. A heavy humidity clung to the air, making it feel like you could slice through it with a knife. The ancient oak trees, those silent sentinels that lined the streets, seemed more imposing than usual. Their gnarled branches stretched out like skeletal arms, draped in Spanish moss that swayed gently in the breeze. The rustling of the leaves sounded like whispered secrets exchanged in the dark. As I navigated the winding roads, my headlights casting eerie shadows on the pavement, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was as if the night itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Over the years, I've heard countless bizarre stories from my passengers. Tales of ghostly apparitions, mysterious disappearances, and the kind of strange happenings that make you question what's real. They'd lean forward from the back seat, eyes wide with fear or excitement, eager to unburden themselves to a stranger who'd listen without judgment. But tonight, those stories lingered in my mind like a warning. The air was thick with more than just humidity. It carried an electricity that prickled my skin and made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I couldn't help but feel that this shift would be unlike any other, that tonight, I might become a part of one of those stories I'd heard so many times before. The road ahead seemed to stretch into infinity, swallowed by the darkness beyond the reach of my headlights. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my mind racing with possibilities of what the night might hold. Little did I know, as I turned the corner onto Main Street, that this would be a night I'd never forget. A night that would unravel secrets better left buried in the shadows. The clock on the dashboard ticked over to midnight, marking the start of a new day, when I spotted her standing under the flickering streetlight on the corner of Pine and Maple. Her figure was shrouded in the kind of shadows that seemed to cling to her, refusing to let go. I pulled up to the curb, rolling down the passenger window to get a better look. She stood motionless for a moment, then stepped forward with a deliberate grace that seemed almost too practiced. She wore a long, dark dress that rustled softly against the ground, its fabric faded but well-kept, like something out of an old photograph. A wide-brimmed hat sat atop her head, casting her face in deep shadow. The few features I could make out were sharp and pale, her eyes hidden beneath the brim. "Where to?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady as she slid into the back seat. The door closed with a soft click, and I could feel a chill settle in the air, as though she'd brought the cold night in with her. "To the old Carson plantation," she replied, her voice carrying an odd, hollow quality that sent a shiver down my spine. It seemed to echo in a way that was both faint and lingering, like a sound trapped in an empty room. As I pulled away from the curb, she began to speak again, unprompted. "Do you know the history of the plantation?" she asked, her tone conversational yet tinged with an unsettling edge. I glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror, but it was as if the glass refused to capture her eyes. They remained hidden in shadow, leaving me with the unsettling impression of staring at an incomplete image. "I've heard stories," I said cautiously, focusing on the road ahead. She nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the passing landscape. "They say it's haunted, you know, by the spirits of those who once lived there and died there. People have seen figures roaming the grounds at night, heard whispers in empty rooms, and felt cold fingers brush against their skin." Her words wrapped around me like a fog, each sentence painting a vivid picture of spectral figures moving silently through the plantation's grand, decaying halls. "They say if you listen closely, you can hear the music from the old ballroom. The parties they held there were legendary, right up until the night it all went wrong." Her voice lowered, almost conspiratorial. "They say it was a fire, but others believe it was something far more sinister. A curse, perhaps, or a betrayal that left its mark on the land. As she spoke, the air inside the cab grew heavier, pressing against me with an invisible weight. I found myself leaning forward, as if caught in her spell, drawn into the world she wove with her words. Yet there was a part of me, the rational part, that wanted to shake it off, to break the hold she seemed to have over the moment. But even as that thought crossed my mind, I realized something strange. I hadn't seen another car or pedestrian since she got in. The streets were eerily empty, as though the world had faded away, leaving just us and the encroaching darkness. "You're quiet," she said suddenly, and I started, feeling her gaze settle on me even though I couldn't see her eyes. "Do you believe in ghosts?" I hesitated, my grip on the steering wheel tightening. "I'm not sure," I admitted, unsure why I felt compelled to answer her truthfully. She smiled, a small, enigmatic curve of her lips. "Perhaps you will be, by the end of the night." Her words hung in the air like a promise or a threat. As we continued our journey toward the old Carson plantation, the road ahead swallowed by shadows that seemed deeper and more ominous than before. I drove for what felt like hours, the woman's words lingering in my mind long after she'd vanished into the shadows of the Carson plantation. It took a while for my heart rate to slow, and even longer for the uneasy chill she left behind to dissipate. I glanced at the empty back seat, half expecting to find some trace of her, but there was nothing, just a faint hint of lavender, barely noticeable in the heavy night air. A crackling voice broke through my thoughts. "Need a ride?" It was the dispatcher, and I cleared my throat, reaching for the radio. "Yeah, who's next?" I replied, trying to sound more composed than I felt. "There's a guy waiting near the corner of Oak and 3rd. Says he needs to go past the cemetery." "Got it," I said, turning the wheel in the direction of the pickup. As I approached, I saw a young man pacing the sidewalk, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His eyes darted nervously, like a rabbit ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. He practically jumped into the cab as soon as I pulled up, mumbling a hurried thanks before shutting the door. I couldn't help but notice the dark circles under his eyes and the way he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting someone or something to be following him. "Where to?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Just past the cemetery," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know it?" I nodded, pulling away from the curb. "Sure do. It's an old place. Lots of history." "Yeah," he said, more to himself than to me. "Lots of history. Too much history." We drove in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the rhythmic thumping of the tires against the asphalt. Finally, he spoke again, his voice a strained whisper. "You ever hear about the murder?" I frowned, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. His eyes were wide and haunted, and I realized he was trembling slightly. "Can't say I have." "What happened?" "It was a long time ago," he said, leaning forward as if he were afraid the words might escape if he didn't get them out fast enough. "A girl. She disappeared one night, and they found her in the cemetery the next morning. No one knows who did it. No one ever found out." He paused, his gaze drifting to the window. "They say the last place she was seen was right here, getting into a taxi. Late at night, just like this." A chill ran down my spine. The words hung heavy in the air, and I suddenly felt the weight of the years pressing down on me. The burden of old secrets and forgotten stories. "That's unsettling," I managed to say, trying to ignore the creeping sensation that was crawling up my neck. "Yeah," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Some people say she still haunts the place, that she's looking for her killer, trying to find peace." As we approached the cemetery, an unnatural fog began to roll in, thick and suffocating. It clung to the ground like a living thing, wrapping itself around the gravestones and twisting through the iron gates. The headlights barely pierced the gloom, and I slowed the car, a sense of foreboding settling in my chest. My radio crackled suddenly, filling the cab with bursts of static that sounded almost like whispering voices. I tapped it, trying to clear the interference, but it only grew louder, filling my ears with its dissonant noise. "Do you hear that?" the young man asked, his voice tight with fear. Yeah, I said, my own voice steady despite the unease gnawing at my insides. It's just the radio acting up. But even as I said it, I knew it was more than that. There was something in the air tonight, something alive and watching, just out of sight. As the fog closed in around us, I felt the shadows of the past reaching out, their cold fingers brushing against the edges of my mind. The young man shifted in his seat, his eyes fixed on the darkened cemetery. Maybe she's still looking for that taxi, he said, his voice trembling with the weight of the past. I nodded slowly, the words catching in my throat. In the silence that followed, I drove on, the fog swallowing us whole as we left the cemetery behind, carrying its secrets and shadows with us into the night. The mist seemed to thicken as I left the cemetery behind, swirling like ghostly apparitions in my headlights. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, just beyond the edges of the light. The young man's story clung to me, an unwelcome companion on this dark ride through the night. I barely had time to collect my thoughts when the radio crackled to life again, the dispatcher's voice cutting through the static. Got another pickup for you. Old man on Pine Street. Says he's heading your way. On my way, I replied, grateful for the distraction. Maybe a mundane ride would help shake the chill that had settled in my bones. As I approached Pine Street, I spotted an elderly gentleman standing on the sidewalk, leaning heavily on a cane. He wore a long coat and a hat pulled low over his face, casting deep shadows across his features. He looked like he belonged to another time, an anachronism in the modern world. I pulled over, and he nodded in thanks, climbing into the back seat with surprising agility. Evening, he said, his voice a low rumble that carried an air of authority. Evening, I replied, pulling back onto the road. Where to? Out by the old bridge, he said, settling back into his seat. Got some business to attend to. I nodded, focusing on the road. Silence stretched between us, the kind that seemed to hum with unspoken words. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. You ever see something you can't explain? I hesitated, images of fog-shrouded graves and ghostly whispers flashing through my mind. Maybe once or twice. Why? He leaned forward, and I caught a glimpse of his eyes in the rearview mirror. Sharp and bright, full of secrets. I saw something once, a long time ago, right here in this town. He paused, and I felt the weight of his gaze, the gravity of his words pulling me in. I saw the murder, the one they all talk about. Saw it happen, clear as day, but no one believed me. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. What did you see? He took a deep breath, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It was a night like this, fog thick as soup, you could hardly see your own hand in front of your face. But I saw it. Saw her get in the cab, and I followed them. He paused again, and I could feel his tension, his fear. It wasn't an ordinary murder. There were others involved. Spirits, angry and vengeful. I saw them, too, replaying the scene over and over, trapped in that moment. A shiver ran down my spine as he continued. Your grandfather was there, too, part of the cover-up. They all thought they could bury it, let it die with them. But the spirits want justice. They won't rest until they get it. I felt my stomach drop, the revelation hitting me like a punch. My grandfather? He died before I was born, leaving behind nothing but stories and whispers. I'd always thought them just that, stories. But now, hearing it from this man, it felt like the past was reaching out, clawing its way into the present. As we neared the old bridge, the car shuddered violently, and the engine sputtered before dying completely. The headlights flickered, plunging us into darkness. I swore under my breath, trying the ignition, but it was no use. We were stuck, stranded in the mist. Look, the old man said, his voice a tense whisper. Look out there. I turned my gaze to the windshield, squinting through the fog. Slowly, figures began to take shape, ghostly and ethereal, moving with a slow, deliberate grace. They played out a macabre dance, a silent reenactment of that fateful night. A woman's scream echoed in the air, a chilling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The mist swirled around them, obscuring details, but I could see enough. The desperation in her movements, the pleading in her eyes as she was dragged away, the shadows that encircled her like predators closing in for the kill. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The old man watched, his expression solemn. This is what they want you to see, to remember, to set right. The weight of his words settled over me, heavy and suffocating. I felt trapped in the past, caught in the web of secrets and lies that had ensnared my grandfather, and now me. As the ghostly figures faded back into the mist, the car shuddered to life, the headlights flickering back on. The old man leaned back, his eyes meeting mine in the mirror. Now you know, he said simply. It's up to you to do something about it. I nodded, words failing me, my mind spinning with questions and possibilities. The mist began to thin as we pulled away from the bridge, leaving behind the shadows and echoes of the past. But I knew they weren't truly gone, that they lingered just out of sight, waiting for justice or redemption. As the old man disappeared into the foggy dawn, his warning echoed in my mind. The drive back to town was a blur, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and dread. I had been thrown into a nightmare where the past refused to die, clinging to me like the lingering mist that shrouded the roads. I parked the cab in my usual spot, but instead of heading home, I found myself walking towards the old cemetery. The sun was rising, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the graves. I stopped at the edge, hesitating as I looked at the rows of weathered tombstones. My grandfather's name was etched into one of them, the letters barely visible through the creeping vines. I had never known him, but now, standing there, I felt his presence more strongly than ever. The ghostly visions from the night haunted my thoughts, vivid and relentless. As I stood there, the world seemed to shift around me. The air grew cold, and I felt a strange pull, like invisible hands guiding me forward. Suddenly, I was no longer alone. Shadows rose from the ground, swirling around me in a spectral dance, and I watched as the events of that night played out before me once more. I was no longer just a witness. I was there, part of the scene, seeing it all through the eyes of a ghostly spectator. The fear, the betrayal, the desperate fight for survival. It all unfolded with brutal clarity. I felt my grandfather's guilt, his complicity in the crime that had bound these spirits to this place. It was overwhelming, the weight of the past pressing down on me. But as the vision faded, leaving me breathless and shaken, I understood what needed to be done. These spirits were trapped in a cycle of torment, caught between worlds, and it was up to me to set them free. Back in the cab, I began to formulate a plan. I had spent years listening to other people's stories, but now it was my turn to share one. I would tell their tale, give voice to those who had none, and bring their truth into the light. Maybe then they could find peace. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I made my decision. I would retire from taxi driving. This was my last night behind the wheel, a night that had changed everything. I turned the key in the ignition, ready to drive home one final time, when the back door opened. A young woman climbed in, her eyes wide with fear and desperation. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I need to get out of here." I met her gaze in the rearview mirror, my heart sinking as I saw the same haunted look that had marked my passengers from the night before. The cycle was beginning again, the past refusing to let go. With a resigned sigh, I nodded and shifted into gear. The road stretched out before me, endless and dark, but this time, I knew I wasn't alone. The spirits of the past traveled with me, guiding my path, urging me to share their story and break the cycle once and for all. As we drove into the rising sun, I realized that the past never truly sleeps. It waits, biding its time, ready to return when we least expect it. But now, I was ready for it, prepared to face the shadows and bring light to the darkness. The taxi moved forward, the journey beginning anew, but this time with purpose and understanding. The stories of the restless spirits would be heard, their cries for justice answered, and perhaps, in time, the past would finally find peace.